to the conversation. Before I introduce our speakers, a few quick housekeeping points. So today's session will run for 90 minutes. If you have questions, please use the chat function or the Q&A function at any time. We will be taking questions in the final section. You do not need to raise your hands, just type. Also, we are recording today's session. The recording will be shared with all registered participants. And now I am glad to introduce our contributors. Our lead speaker and moderator today is Dr. Daniela Jenkins. She is the Executive Director of the Women's Budget Group here in the UK. She has a long history of working on pensions, and she is part of the Commission on Pensions, if I'm not wrong, Daniela. And we are joined also from the US by Dr. Martha Susanna James. She's a senior research economist at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Martha is a feminist labor economist with over 10 years of experience in applied macroeconomics, gender and social policy, and feminist retirement research. She holds a PhD in public and urban policy from the New School, and she will touch upon the Colombian context today. From the Swana region, we have Farah Hashemi. She's a senior fellow and program director for social protection at the Arab Reform Initiative. Farah is policy and development economist with over 9 years of experience advancing race-based public policy reforms across the Arab region. And from South Africa, we have Professor Elena Moore. Hopefully, she's now able to join us. Professor of sociology at the University of Cape Town and principal investigator of the Family Caregiving Program. Elena's research spans social change, family inequalities, and the relationship between families and the state. She holds a Wellcome Career Award and leads a major IDRC-funded research program on care innovations in Africa. Thank you all again for being here. And now I will hand over to Dr. Daniela Jenkins to open our first session on deconstructing the global pension gap. The floor is yours, Daniela.
Thank you so much, Sana, and thank you everyone for joining this session on a global perspective on pensions. Now, I recognize that people are coming from different perspectives. We've got some pensions experts I can see on the call today. We've got experts in gender budgeting, people who are interested, stakeholders who are actually from the pensions world itself. And here I'm actually sat here in London this afternoon. It's very exciting within the UK because we've had a pensions commission. So a very big report that the government have commissioned, which has been released today. So that will be my light reading this evening, is to go through that. But one of the things that really came through that report and through that process of examining the pension system within the UK is recognizing the fact that there is a large, persistent gender pensions gap. But I think it's important to highlight that this session today is not here to sort of deconstruct or look at the nitty-gritty of the UK pension system. It's actually to examine what is a global, and I would go as far as to say a universal phenomena by which we see that pension systems, wherever they manifest, are gendered. And what we mean by gendered is that we consistently have different outcomes for men and women coming out of the same system itself. So I think it's really important. Sorry, if you could move to the next slide, please, Siobhan. And one more, please. Thank you. I think it's really important that we set our terms, first of all. What do we mean by a pension? Now, pensions can mean different things to different people. They can mean different things within different contexts as well. I'm going back here. Now, this is one framework that is used to describe pensions, but I think it's useful to let us see the breadth of what a pension can be within a globalized context. So I'm drawing on the 5 pillars framework, which was developed by the World Bank back in 2005 when they were looking at pensions reform. And the World Bank really described pensions in the way of sort of 5 different sort of pillars that you might use for pensions. Now, if we look at Pillar Zero, so that's the one that they kind of retrofitted afterwards, was the base or social pension. And this is essentially where the state provides a pension for when people are no longer economically active. So when they're no longer in employment, you get a zero pillar of pension. So this is it. It is provided. What's called the first pillar, which people who have sort of pension systems, sort of state pension systems, might be more familiar with, is a sort of mandatory. So everybody is sort of locked into this system in some way, but it is a publicly managed pension system. So money goes in, state manages that in some way, money is distributed to people at some point of retirement, post-economic activity at the end. We also have, similar to that, is a sort of second pillar of state managed, not managed necessarily, but it's mandatory. So everyone goes in. So there's a mechanism by which everybody is sort of brought into the pension system, but that is through occupational. So through the course of your work, effectively, part of your pay is skimmed into that system. And that's normally called a process of smoothing, where your income is smoothed over your lifetime. So you take out money a little bit every time you get paid through your pay. That is mandated. So there is still a sort of state role there in terms of keeping that system going. And then at the point at which you are no longer economically active, then you can basically get that money drip fed back to you when you're older, in old age. Now, the third pillar is effectively getting your gold talents and burying them. So that is voluntary personal pension schemes where you save up and then you pay into your own sort of savings. And there, again, it might have a pensions product. So it may be different. It may differ from, a traditional savings scheme. So it may have, particular facets around sort of long-term investments that allows that to crystallize over time. But that's the sort of third pillar that the World Bank sort of describe. And then we have what my granddad would have called my pension plan is I had 9 daughters, which is the voluntary pension scheme that effectively is non-financial. And for a lot of the world, this is the reality of what a pension is. You don't pay into a financialized product. You have a system, a social system of support, care that might be partly financial. It might be a process of being supported by family members, intergenerationally, for example, by communities in some way, shape, or form, when people are no longer able to work in a way that they are able to be economically active. And so I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about pensions, when we talk about pension systems, they can be different things. And actually, in most countries, in most environments, there is a mixture of some of those things. So particularly within the UK, for example, we will see definitely that we have, a mixture of, first pillar, second pillar, third pillar within our pension system. And you'll see a different balance of different types of things where what we call a pension might be manifested in different ways. What I think is really important is to recognize that all of these pillars are gendered. So they lead to different outcomes for men and women. And if you're able to move to the next slide, please, Siobhan, we might start to examine why that is very briefly. So if you think about the sort of systems that I've described, they're either talking about paid work, so paid employment, or they're talking about unpaid care. Now, what we know is that women are much more likely to engage in the provision of unpaid care and are much less likely globally to participate within economic paid activities. So the type that the sort of first and second pillars lead to pensions contributions. So what we see is this interaction between unpaid work and paid work, which is less likely to for women to be engaged in paid work, and where women do engage in paid work, it is normally for less recompense than men. That both of these things, the interaction, the interplay of those two things, means that it's much more likely that women are likely to have worse outcomes in terms of pension systems globally. And that's what we see, particularly where we see formal pension systems. We will see that women do worse than men to differing degrees. Partly that depends on the design of those systems, and we'll come to that later within this seminar. But it's important to recognize that from the outset, we have baked in, partly because we don't recompense, we don't reward so much of that social reproduction work that women do, that we know that pensions lead to gendered outcomes. Now, the slide that you'll see on the screen, I'm not going to run through in a huge amount of detail. That draws on the work of actually a number of researchers here in the UK, but we can widen that out to other countries, to other environments as well. We know that there are accumulative effects that result as a result of gendered inequalities, economic gendered inequalities, that lead to women having worse pensions outcomes all around the world in different systems, in different places. What are the things that we do know? We know that women have babies. We know that women are much more likely to take time out. We know that women are less likely to be paid the same amount as men where they are paid. We know that women are more likely to provide unpaid social care, whether that is to family members, whether that is intergenerational, so grandmothers, for example, providing care to their grandchildren, and the cumulative effect. So that stacked effect of all of those things across the life course mean that women are very often left struggling in old age because those pension systems really don't recognize, reward, or are built around, designed around those normalized patterns that women so often have in terms of their life courses. And that this is part of the reason why we see again and again and again, regardless of the country, regardless of the system, that we see these gendered outcomes that crystallize as a result of that. So part of our discussion today is really to understand, what can we do about this? Every economic system that we have relies on women's labor, relies on social reproduction. And so how is it that we can have and develop systems that allow women to be able to not necessarily retire, because retirement isn't necessarily an option for everybody within every country, but to reach old age, to get past the point of being economically active in a way that is sustainable? And so that is really the question that we are asking ourselves today, is how can we recognize that with the pension systems that we have and that we inhabit? So that's my opener. That's my starter for 10, and hopefully that sets the tone for our today's session. I'd like to briefly open, if I can do, to our contributors to perhaps share some of their initial thoughts around the gender pensions gap, as we call it, and the differences that we see in terms of pensions outcomes from all of our different perspectives around the world. So if I could perhaps first of all call on Marta.
Hi everyone. Hi, Dr. Jenkins. Thank you. And I'll add to this that there's a very important element to the outcomes that we're observing in terms of like in pensions and the benefits, the gender benefits that we're observing. And it's that the structural element comes from the labor market. And there is a labor market that captures both labor dynamics. One of those, the first one is the gender wage gap. So that is going to cut the contributions of women into their retirement wealth. Of course, the spotty contributions due to different levels of attachment to the labor force, which are mainly due to the social norms that have a gendered approach to caregiving. So as Dr. Jenkins mentioned, there is an important element derived from the fact that caregiving, and especially unpaid caregiving, is gendered. It's mostly women due to social norms who have carried the impact of that unpaid caregiving, therefore leading to a main dichotomy, let's say, or a substitution between providing this unpaid care or being attached to the labor force and generating an income that leads to a pension contribution. And then the other important thing is that there is this individualized approach both to caregiving, or like leading or caregiving into the household and then into women, without having a more social approach. In that sense, it's important to think of the relationship between between pensions and the socialization of caregiving. And then another important element, and I'll leave it there, which is the competition, or the element of formal employment versus informal employment. That is it's something that's latent in the global South, and many of the workers in the global South just don't have an employment that leads to a pension contribution, and the likelihood of women in being this kind of employment is also very high. So some ideas to add to what Dr. Jenkins included.
Thank you so much, Marta. And perhaps if I could call on Elena next.
Elena is not able to join.
Oh, sorry.
She has some technical problems. We are trying to sort that out.
No worries. Could I call on Farah?
Of course, with pleasure. Thank you, Daniela. Nice to meet you, and many thanks for having me today. I think the issue of the gendered perspective to pension is very critical, obviously in the world, but also in the Arab region. Now, speaking about the Arab region, actually, at baseline, okay, we don't have decent, adequate, effective, sustainable, and inclusive social protection systems at baseline. In Lebanon, for example, we only have an end of service indemnity, and pension law 319 passed and got approved, but it still needs implementation decrees, and we haven't yet done this. So we still don't have pension for private sector employees. Same for Iraq, same for Jordan. I can tell you more about this later. The thing is that when we speak about the lack of pension, it's not just that this is causing gender discrimination. We need to think that women at baseline, or regardless of discrimination in pension, they are more vulnerable. They are more susceptible to shock on average. Why is it so? Especially in the region, if you look at the inheritance laws, at family laws, all the discrimination that happens there, people are underprivileged, and this means that when there is a country with no old age benefits, when there is a country with no elderly grants, when there is a country with only an end of service indemnity and no decent pension for old age, then because women are more vulnerable and more susceptible, they are more likely to be affected by this and to be more impoverished due to the lack of the system. Now, gender discrimination exists everywhere, but in the region, as you know, it's more accentuated because of social norms, because of intertwining between religious and political elites, or between religious groups and politicians. And I mean, these, in addition to matters of inheritance, they are also driving basically the eye through which we're seeing women in a way that is very detrimental to how women are included or not in social protection systems in general, and in pensions more particular. For example, we still, in many parts of the region, treat women as dependent of male breadwinners. This just recently we solved it in Lebanon, but we still have many other countries that have this issue. We treat them as dependents, and for example, for the male breadwinner to be able to cover their family, they don't need to prove anything. It's autonomous. However, for a woman to be able to cover herself and to cover her family members through the security funds, for example, she needs to prove and to go through a process to prove that she's the only breadwinner and that she's not she's got actually dependents. This is impacting how we see survivor benefits, how we see widow pensions, and how we see survivor benefits, and how we promote actually widow pensions. So the entry point to pension, when we look at women, it's also not the right one. Not to mention that, and I can go into details later, but these are the key issues that I wanted to flag ahead, because they have to do with the theory, with the concept, with the definition of pension, and how we can fix it from the onset in a way that is not gender blind. A cause and effect, I don't think so, but these are dynamics, and these are political decisions, in my opinion, because there is sometimes a political will to do something, and there is sometimes a lack of political will to do something, which is also a political decision. So this policy in action to fix this is something to take into consideration, because it means a lot, and because it means that, and how much social protection has an economic multiplier effect, and social pension can have an economic multiplier effect, and how much the role of women can become stronger economically if they are well covered by social protection. But speaking about retirement age, we don't need to think about productivity. Retirement is a right, and pension is a right, regardless of productivity. But despite that, women are not still not seen as priorities. However, they are seen in many programs that are related to old age benefits, and not necessarily just pension. They're being seen as beneficiaries to distribute aid or basically benefits to the rest of the household. So they are the conduit. And we rarely see women as themselves people that fall into poverty in old age. So these basically are the macro political level things that we need to think of. And then now we can together dismantle maybe in the coming parts of the discussion, we can dismantle a little bit the status quo and the map of the pension systems in the Arab region, to be able to see how this is materializing in practice. But to begin with, grosso modo, the picture is very gloomy in the Arab region, and it is a political question, and it's also something that requires real attention if we are to, and real prioritization. We cannot keep putting this on the back burner every time we have a conflict. We're a conflict afflicted region. We cannot, every time we have a conflict or we have a new emergency, put pensions on the back burner, because they're not, or they don't belong to what the international community and humanitarian actors and donors call the shock responsive social protection. In my opinion, pensions are the most shock responsive form of social protection. It's not humanitarian aid only that is shock responsive. I'm going to stop here. I can talk more in detail about the region in the coming parts of the discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Farah. So I believe we do have Elena with us. Perhaps, Elena, if you just briefly wanted to share a few of your views in terms of the South African perspective.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay, great. I don't know if you can see me, but at least you can hear me.
I can see you.
Okay, sorry about that. There's many tech Zoom related issues when it comes to different countries. Anyway, I think I will be very brief, and I'll speak specifically to Pillar 1, Dr. Jenkins, and it's lovely to meet you. I do have to, I suppose, confirm and also build on what our colleague Farah Al-Shami was talking about. I think in the South and the Southern Africa, I'll speak for Southern Africa, but obviously South Africa specifically, thinking about pensions, specifically when we think about 3/4 of the population and we're looking at state pensions, so we're looking at Pillar 1 from that model mainly, thinking about pensions in isolation of other forms of social protection really isn't helpful. And I say this because in other parts of the world, we think about, like Dr. Jenkins obviously outlined, the impact on why there is a gender pay pension gap. But in South Africa and Southern Africa, where state pensions are pretty much universal, it actually is a paradox where the gendered work impacts beyond 60, to the point where, in the absence of social protections for working age, able-bodied persons, adults, working age and able-bodied, attach themselves to households where there are pensions. And therefore, pension-headed households, or just households where there are pensions, state pensions in there, become very large. So it's not really, for the vast majority of the population, it's not about per se labor force participation during the life course, although that is obviously very relevant for some and for many, a bit less so in when we take historical disadvantages into consideration. But it's more about the universal pensions that do exist, the reach that they can have when they are the only or the most dominant form of social protection in a country or in a range of countries in the region. And that's where we see a gender pension gap, I should say, emerging. Because when a pension is the only form or the dominant form of social protection in a country, the number of people coming into that household radically increases. And therefore the reach of that pension to the individual, and largely to women, and largely to Black South African women, is much, much less. And so that's something I want to share a little bit later in the presentation, is about thinking about pensions not in isolation from other forms of social protection, because otherwise we don't get to understand why there is a gender pension gap and where that comes from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Moore, and apologies again for the technical problems. I'm very, very happy you are with us now. And thank you, Daniela, and everyone for framing the challenge we are here to address and to discuss. And we can now move to part 2, where each of you will take us deeper into your regional or country context. So if Martha, do you want to go next?
Okay, so just also to start, I'll start by framing and explaining a little bit the case of the Colombian pension system, a very particular pension system, in the context of the pillars that Dr. Jenkins presented and the scheme that Dr. Jenkins presented. We can move to the next slide. I'll give a bit of a comparison also with the United States pension scheme. But let's start with the Colombian one, where we have at the moment, and you can go to the next slide for please. There is like the main thing is that the operating or the existing system is a system where we have what we will call the insurance portion, or the first pillar or zero pillar that Dr. Jenkins presented. Publicly administered pay-as-you-go system designed as an social insurance mechanism competing with a individual accounts defined contribution system. So first, a defined benefit system competing with a defined contribution system, where workers can choose to contribute to one or the other. So the two systems have been competing for nearly 32 years. And let's think about the outcomes that I'm going to share as the result of these two competing systems. So one that is redistributive in nature, that has many subsidies embedded in the system, and another one that is basically an absolute result of the individual lifetime earnings and the contributions that the worker has into the individual account system. The pay-as-you-go system is publicly administered, as I mentioned, and the individual accounts it's privately administered, which will have a series of features that lead to a high complexity in the system. Some of those linked to administrative fees that have to be charged into the system that are somewhat higher in the individual accounts privately administered system than in the publicly administered system. But the main feature of the Colombian system operating at the moment, right, is that there is a competing, instead of a dual pillar or a multiple pillar that let's say supplements each other. There is this competing scheme that leads to very different outcomes, even for the same. If we had like a typical same type of worker, contributing to one system or the other would lead to very different pension benefits in the retirement phase. So that's an important thing. It is a mandatory scheme, so all workers employed on a formal basis should be contributing to the social protection system, which would be both the pension portion of the social protection and the health insurance portion of the social protection, where the pension system operates in this dual competing system. Now, a very important thing, and I jumped over my first note here in the slide, and it's that there was a reform approved in Congress in June 2024 in Colombia, which is trying to solve this issue of competition. The reform has a lot of elements that actually solve the most important structural, the design features of the pension system that are leading to very low coverage rates and very engendered pension gaps. Yet the Constitutional Court ruled that there's a hold on the reform. So at the moment, the current system is still operating under the 1993 law, and we're still in this competing dual scheme that I'm pointing out here. So another important thing, people can switch between systems, so they can, like, if they decide that they want to go from the pay-as-you-go defined benefit system into the individual account system, they can do it throughout their lifetime, but they can switch only once every 5 years. So this leads to even more complexity in the system and very diverse outcomes, therefore, in terms of how these individual decisions can impact pension benefits in the retirement phase. The contributions are of 16%, 12% contributed by the employer, 4% contributed or taxed to the worker, with a maximum or a cap of 25 minimum wage levels, or like salaries equal to 25 times the minimum wage. So that's a very broad overview of what the current scheme in Colombia is. Now, if we go to the next slide, please. So this is a very, again, particular system in the world. There's been a lot of interest in understanding the outcomes of this competing system, enough years of implementation to have very interesting results coming out of the system. But let's say that the main takeaway is that coverage is very low. But the main reason is that a lot of the incentives in the labor market, and as I previously mentioned, lead to many workers working under informal schemes, which means they do not adhere to the social protection mandate established by the law. So in Colombia, around 60% of workers, and this is also a very broad indicator, around 60% of workers are informal. And the likelihood of women being informal workers is much higher compared to men. And we can go a lot into the discussion of why this is the case. Most importantly, it's derived, again, from elements of the labor market and the gendered elements of the labor market, which is that women are, as in many other labor markets in the world, segregated into certain occupations that are mainly impacted either by the informality element of the labor market, or by a lack of earnings or better earnings that can have better contributions into the system. So here you have also a graph that is showing some of the most important elements. And in terms of my presentation today, I want to focus on two things, two features that I call the gendered features of the Colombian pension system. One of which is that there's a differential age, so operating both in the initial scheme or the initial system implemented in 1993. Women's retirement age was set at 57 years, which is a very low age, and men's retirement age, statutory retirement age, is set at 62. So a 5-year difference that has a very important impact in terms of the period of the contribution period for those workers. Why? Because regardless of the possibility of continuing labor attachment and continuing a contribution period, statutory ages, as we can see all around the world, operate mainly as an important signal for the retirement age for a lot of workers. So what we see in Colombia is that, in fact, yes, a lot of women retired at an age very close to the retirement age, to the statutory retirement age, cutting the period of contributions compared to men, right? Another important element that's been claimed, and it's been also contested through the Constitutional Court, is that despite having a differential age, and this is for the defined benefit pay-as-you-go system, and as you see here in the graph, despite having a differential age, the requirements for the pension entitlement are exactly the same. So the number of weeks of contribution is exactly the same for men and women. So this has had I would say, like it has improved the outcome in terms of the differential statutory age, because a lot of women then continue to contribute until they have the number of weeks required for retirement. So this has increased the retirement age a little bit beyond the average retirement age, a little bit beyond the 57 years, yet it's still shorter than men's. And then another feature that I'll point as a very important feature is the fact that for both the defined contribution and the defined benefit systems, there are differential life tables used for the actuarial calculations of the benefits for men and women. So if we go to the next slide, so we're going to have a combination of two gendered elements that are detrimental to women's benefits and the access to pensions, so the actual entitlement to pension. The first one, as I mentioned, is the differential retirement age, with the same requirements for retirement, which is kind of like offsetting a little bit the differential retirement age. But then another important element, which is that the whole system uses gender-specific life tables to calculate the benefits and to do all of the actuarial analysis, both in the defined benefit and the defined contribution system. So what is the impact of this? That the mortality rate of women is a lot lower. Life expectancy is much higher, as you see here. As of 2023, women's life expectancy in Colombia was around 80.13 years. Men's life expectancy was 24.23 years. So more or less a gap of 5 years in life expectancy. Combined with the differential retirement age, we're having an average of around 7 to 10 years less of contributions for, 5 years less of contributions for women, added to 5 more years of benefit need, right? Leading to more or less 7 to 10 years of an expanded period of benefit need for women compared to men. So this overall leads to, combined with less lifetime earnings, less contributions to the systems, to a very pronounced pension gender gap, which leads to women having to expand the amount of retirement wealth for a much longer period of time, cutting the benefits that they're going to be receiving just because of these two features of the system. So if we go to the next slide, so what are some of the results of this? So what we see is that, and I like to split it into what is the income gap, right? So what would be the different levels of earnings throughout the lifetime that lead to the outcome in pensions in terms of a pension gap? So what we say is in Colombia, we have an average income gap of around 23%. So women's earnings are around 23% shorter than men's, or women earn just around 77% of what men earn, or of a peso in Colombia, let's say. So that 23% leads to two main retirement gaps. The first one is in terms of access. So entitlement is derived from a combination of the number of weeks that the person has contributed. And as we have already established, there's a combination of the impact of unpaid caregiving leading to detachment from the labor force. So a lot of gaps in terms of the timing of the contributions, and also a lot of lower earnings throughout the periods of contribution compared to men, which lead to sometimes insufficient retirement wealth. So when the combined analysis of the retirement wealth versus the number of weeks that the person has contributed to the system, in addition to the actuarial calculation of how many years in retirement will the person need to expand this retirement wealth, leads to a very high, very challenging conditions for women, right? So women overall are entitled to pension or have an access to a retirement around 20 to 20.4% of the women who have contributed to the system. Remember that we're also talking about much less women who are in the labor force who have a formal employment, so much less women are going to have access to or have the possibility to contribute to the system. And of those, only 20.4% actually have access to a retirement benefit. And then this compared to men who are around 31%, so more or less an 11% gap. And then finally, the retirement gap in terms of, or the retirement income gap in terms of the actual benefits that women receive compared to men. So what we see in here, we are pointing to the actual gap. In the defined contribution scheme or individual accounts, women have 14.2% gap compared to the pay-as-you-go scheme, which is a 5.7% gap. Somehow I'm doing in terms of time.
It would be great if you could wrap up in the next minute or so.
Okay, thank you. So the main thing in here is just a summary of what I was saying. We have two features of the pension system in terms of design that combine to the labor market gender gaps that we can observe throughout the lifetime, combined with them, lead to very poor access or a significant access gap in terms of retirement benefits and a significant retirement income gap for women compared to men. And that's a point that we'll talk a little bit more as we move into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martha. The picture from Colombia is really striking and kind of unique. Professor Elena Moore, can we come to you now to tell us about South Africa more in detail?
Sure, great. Are you going to manage the slides? Thank you. Thanks, Siobhan. Okay, do you want to maximize it? Thank you. So I think what I'm going to do, as I mentioned earlier, is I'm going to focus on this roughly 70% of the population who receive state pensions, rather than the 30% of older persons who receive private pensions. And I do that for a range of reasons, to give, I think, a picture that is more reflective of what's obviously happening for the majority of people, but also what's happening on the ground. And I think we're talking here about non-contributory pensions, if that's not clear. We're talking about a pension system. So we work in the Family Caregiving Program of Southern Africa. We work across 4 countries. And what I'll say specifically about South Africa holds quite a lot for Namibia, Botswana, and other middle-income countries in the region. You can obtain any of our reports. The red report at the top right will cover a lot of what I'll be talking about today. So basically, in South Africa, you can, next slide, please. In South Africa, we are, as I said, okay, next slide again, please. Thank you. So if you think about the region, first of all, you think, particularly middle-income countries across the region, you have what's quite noticeable is this kind of paradoxical state of having very high levels of poverty, particularly amongst older persons, despite the presence of a pension. And a pension, obviously, that's fairly universal. It's universal in Namibia and Botswana, as I stated, but almost universal in South Africa, with really only the very elite and higher incomes being excluded. Now, these figures are a little bit out of date, but not hugely out of date. And basically, you have, a level of income poverty of about 20%, 14% in Namibia, up to 18% in Botswana, despite older persons receiving as individuals sums of state pensions that are sometimes 2 times higher than the level of poverty. So what I mean by that is actually older persons as pension recipients, state pension recipients, have access to considerable income, and I say that in inverted commas, in comparison to others, right? So to give you an example, the state pension in South Africa is about roughly 4 times the amount that the children receive. And that's really important, because we see that when we put the large sum of money in older persons' hands, particularly in older women's hands, we see what happens. And so that's partly to explain why such high levels of poverty exist despite the presence of a pension. Now, another thing we need to think about is the size of households where pensioners live or older persons live. And households are large, on average 5 or 4 people, but often, if we think of Black South African households only, that number will be more likely to be 7 or 8. So you have high numbers of people relying off a state pension, and that explains partially why this level of a kind of income poverty exists. We also have high levels of rural living in the area. And so the cost of living in a rural area is higher because transport's higher, access, to many services is much more costly. Even accessing water can be more costly. So this is just giving you an understanding about the region more broadly. If you move on to the next slide, we can go into the specifics of South Africa. So somewhat probably similar stats that you might, no, last one, go back one, please. Yes, thank you. So we talk about older person grant beneficiaries. We're talking about state pensioners in South Africa. Now, if you think of a pension gender gap, you might be thinking that, older persons, state pensioners, men receive more. Well, that's not the case. More than twice as many women are older person grant beneficiaries in South Africa. They're more likely to be widows, but also they live longer than men, but they live in longer and poorer health than men. So these factors together, it creates this kind of perplexed idea that there is a pension gap, a pension gender gap, if we only look at the individual, right? So if we look at individual income and compare it, then we might not argue there's a pension gap. But if we look at household income and compare it, then we begin to see very large pension gaps, gender pension gaps. In addition to obviously talking about gender pension gaps, we're very much talking about racialized pension gaps. 80%, so the number of older person grant beneficiaries kind of reflects the broader breakdown of the population in South Africa. So 80% of the state pensioners are Black South Africans. And as I said earlier, where older persons and where state pensioners reside is really important because the cost of living in rural areas is so much higher. Also, older persons are living with very specific conditions which require them to have quite high costs as individuals, but also as households. And those high levels of diabetes, hypertension can often result in much higher care need costs. And that all comes together. So if you move on to the next slide, please. We begin to think about, if you go dig deeper into the households. So here we think about who's living with the older person. Now remember that the unemployment level in South Africa is roughly 50% for young adults, and on average about 40% for adults more broadly. So older persons generally, I say older persons, I mean state pensioners, of course. State pensioners generally only live in a household, only 20% of state pensioners live in a household where there is another income coming in that's not social protection. So as I say, when I say that they are the main source of income, they're also sometimes the only source of income and only source of a relatively high value. So if we look at households that are multi-generational, i.e. someone who's under 18, over 60, and someone in between, roughly 2/3 of all households are made up like that, right? And so if we think that there's high levels of unemployment in such households, needless to say, the number of people drawing on that same pension increase. And that's where we begin to see differences across across different older person-headed households. So if we move on to the next slide, this gives us a more detailed breakdown. If we think of the older person grant a person alone, so in the first picture of the little house, you have one person living alone, and at the time the state pension was 2,681. And that they have individual access to that. I mean, that's if we take the assumption that they're not sharing it with neighbors or other people outside of the house, other family members who are living elsewhere. However, if we compare that to an older person who's living in a multi-generational household, the average household income obviously is higher, but the relative amount that the older person can access because it's divided by at least 5 persons is much lower. And we see how this varies not just across household size, but also across provinces. So some of the poorest areas in South Africa, for example, in the Eastern Cape or KwaZulu-Natal, or other areas such as in Limpopo, for example, they have very low household incomes and very high levels of older persons living in them. These are usually rural populations. So as I mentioned earlier on, in a rural setting, the source of household income coming in from an older person is largely grant-based. Here it shows you that it's only about 4% of income coming in to an older person household in a rural area is from a private pension, and that goes up to about 9% when we look at urban areas. If you go to the next slide, we can look at this in other ways too. If we think about the real cost of living, and it goes back to an earlier slide and point where I compared Botswana and Namibia, and there'll be similar findings there too. If we take 5 persons in a household, and if we think the older person grant is roughly, let's call it 2,000, and you've got 2 older persons living in that household, your basic monthly household income is, give or take, the 4,000 plus, let's say there's a child living in the household who gets about 500 rand. Now, the money that goes to a child is ring fenced for children and is largely spent on transport for school and lunch at school. And that's a very dominant pattern across South Africa. However, the money that is given to state pensioners for state pension is largely shared within the household more broadly. So this is actually quite a small household. There's only 5 people living in the household. There are, however, 4 adults in this household. 2 adults are unemployed and needless to say, draw on the support of the 2 older persons, the pensioners, in order to survive. Now, we will break down the cost of living, and I don't need to go into obviously the ins and outs of this. We see that obviously food would take up, and this is a very bare minimum of food costs, would take up an entire pension alone. And that's, the kind of food costs and the cost of living, as we know, is radically increasing year on year. The only way this household can survive, and this household is fairly unique because it does have 2 pensions, not just one, is that it obtains a loan. And needless to say, the loan creates further debt and it impacts the value, the real value that pension can have. Next slide, please. So the consequences really of the gendered pension gap is that older persons have to manage and struggle to obtain very basic elements of life, such as food, transport costs, and other necessities. So I see someone has asked the question, what is funeral policy? So I might as well attend to that while we're here. Funeral policies are monthly allocations that would be seen as a standard, largely to cover the cost of a funeral. So that is, while in some households you might have life insurance and life policies, a funeral policy is different in that it only covers the cost of a funeral. The transition into the afterlife in Southern Africa and across Africa is a very important cost. It's a real cost. It's a cost like food. It's a necessity and will not be sacrificed in any way, despite lower levels of income, for example. And so that cost is often prioritized over food. But because the number of persons in the household increases because of the presence of a pension, and there is other writing on this, the kind of the indirect consequences of the deracialization of pensions in 1994, where the number of persons in households radically increased. It was called a perverse incentive. Well, here what we see is really people having older persons and older women in particular who are living in larger households, having to manage costs in ways that create a very high level of gendered and racialized differences across households. If we move on to the next slide. I think it's the second last slide. So these tensions are very real, and they feature in different ways, particularly in relations to tensions within households across different relations. But what I will say is, across Southern Africa, we're doing a lot of this work on mapping state spending on older persons over 20 years or 2 or 3 decades. And what we find is that social protection has become very pension-centric. Spending on older persons has become very pension-centric. Whilst it's a key mechanism for alleviating poverty, it's the only real mechanism for supporting older persons. And because in this regard, there's very little money spent on care provision. So older persons actually, particularly those living with disabilities, need to use their pension to cover the cost of their own care. So when we talk about the consequences, we can move on to the next slide. We talk about the consequences of the gender pension gap. The real challenges, as I mentioned right at the beginning, are the gaps in social protection for able-bodied working-aged people, and therefore the pension having to do a lot more than what it's intended for. Another huge gap that is experienced particularly by women and older women is a limited care provision, including access to care-related materials such as incontinence products or wheelchairs, and the high cost of older persons living with disabilities and older persons living in rural areas. Whilst there has been obviously radical reform in 1994, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, pensions have been in long existence in South Africa, but were deracialized completely into the post-independent period. A current reform currently underway is thinking about the difference in relation to state pensions between married women and unmarried or single women or widowed women. And that's something we can talk about in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's incredibly interesting. And thank you for taking us through the complexity of this pension system, but also the inequalities in South Africa. And I don't know if that changed, but South Africa, I heard it's like the most unequal country in the world. And yeah, thank you so much. Farah, are you ready to come in and take us through the Arab region and Lebanon especially?
Thank you. I can happily do so. And many thanks to colleagues, Professor Elena and Marta, for their presentations. Very insightful and informative. The Arab region, in addition to what I said, at the beginning, which basically seconded or echoed the presentation by Dr. Danielle. It is a gloomy picture in the Arab region, unfortunately, but that is both due to domestic or regional reasons, but also to global reasons, because we have to also remember the global financial architecture that is running the world now. And we need to know that, especially, as led by international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and as coinciding with new transformations in the labor market. We can talk about AI, automation, digitalization, the digital economy. We can talk about decarbonization, the green and energy transition, and neoliberal economic policies, and how these self-reinforce or reinforce each other and interact, and how neoliberal policies per se are promoted by international financial institutions that are promoting private sector, private-led development solutions that are basically privatizing pension systems. And this is part of why pension systems have become so inequitable, because green tech is going in the private way. Digitalization is going in the private way. The full green economy is going private, and also neoliberal policies promote private development solutions. And this is both through privatizing industries privatizing the economy, but also through privatizing pension systems themselves. And here comes two key issues. First of all, when we privatize pension systems, we make them unaffordable, and people have to pay them out of pocket. And this is also putting women in a very critical situation, especially due to the income gap that disproportionately affects women, as we were talking. But also the privatization of the economy in general is leading to more informalization. The more privatization we have, the more informalization we have, because as you know, we have informal labor in the formal economy, and the private sector, private companies have a tendency to, especially like nowadays, because they are profit oriented, to go informal when it comes to labor, to non-standard forms of work, 0-hour contracts, and so on and so forth. And this is a gendered space. Women are more likely to work on a freelance basis, on a part-time basis, on a remote basis, and on an informal basis, because they often have less opportunities to begin with, which make them either, I mean, we're speaking on average, and that mainly applies to the Arab region, which make them less qualified and then have to resort to less secure jobs because these are usually more acceptable, but also women benefit from remote work and from non-standard forms of work, particularly on a part-time or freelance basis, because they often have double careers. In the Arab region, we still have the concept of housewives a lot like entrenched in the culture of many Arab societies, but also those that aren't housewives are often mothers with a double career at home, unpaid care work at home, and a career. And so this also makes this is part of why the informal space and the private space in the economy is very genderized. And here comes why we have a differential impact in the pension basically landscape when it comes to women, to the detriment of women. It's because basically women. So sorry, I lost my line of thought. I'm a bit exhausted. I was saying this to Samah. It's because actually women in the private sector, okay, and in the informal sector, they can pay contributions less. They can afford contributions less, and we often confuse pension to social pension. Social pension is not contributory, okay, and pension is contributory. So first of all, this doesn't make it or doesn't justify as to why so many governments haven't yet implemented their pension schemes, because contributory pension is self-financed. So if there is a political will, there is no challenge to this from a financial perspective. But still, we don't see pension. I was speaking about Iraq, that hasn't yet implemented law 1.8, law 18. I was speaking about Lebanon, that has law 319 that still doesn't have implementation decrees. In Morocco, for example, under the framework law 09.21, it's more on the targeted using the social registry. The same for Egypt in the Takaful and Karama project, which is a cash transfer program with old age benefits, so they have no basically pension. And in Tunis, they struggle with the funding, so because it is a political decision again. So contributory pensions aren't basically are a political decision that is not happening, but at the same time, when it's happening, people cannot afford it. Often pension in the private sector is a contributory pension, and in the public sector it's a contributory pension, and because of the income gap that is to the disadvantage of women, women cannot pay those contributions. They cannot afford these contributions, so that's part of why they are excluded. When it comes to the social pension that is non-contributory, it is to begin with not put in place. And that is also because of spending priorities of governments and because of fiscal consolidation and austerity measures that are recommended by international financial institutions, and because of decisions by the governments not to prioritize, as I said, payments over there. So the fact that we don't have non-contributory pension, okay, is excluding informal the informal sector, because by having only contributory pension is being only employment based, and in this employment, the non-standard form of work is putting women at stake because they either cannot afford the contributions, or because international financial institutions are promoting or are reducing employers' shares to the contributions. So instead of us seeing the state doing state-funded care credits and subsidizing the contributions to pensions for women, for the case of women, we see the opposite. We see that they are following recommendations by international financial institutions, and they are reducing the employers' shares of the contributions to incentivize the profit-oriented private sector. And this is what we call the tax wedge, by the way. So this is how it is. In addition to the privatization and to informalization, let's speak about the private sector, the public sector, sorry. The public economy, the public sector dominates the economies in the Arab region. And that is also political, because usually we use the public sector and employment over there, which is very ballooned. We use it to be able to increase the constituent space politically, to be able to buy votes. So we employ you, we hire you, and you follow us. And this is how most political regimes have been basically surviving. In the public sector, if we look at statistics across the Arab region, women are more, they are also more represented in the public sector. The share of women labor force participation in the public sector is higher. And that is also understandable, because women often tend to go for, because of the situation that they're in, that we all know about, they tend to go for secure jobs, less challenging jobs, and basically easy to get jobs, which are political jobs, basically jobs that they can buy through their votes. So it's a corruption thing, but this is. I mean, the presence of women in the public sector is, on the other side, giving some opportunities. So we need to also, so it's not intentional, but I mean, we have to say it, that because women are more present in the public sector, it makes some of the women benefit from the fact that they have pension, whereas others that work in the private sector or are unemployed do not have pension. And that is because in Arab countries, we have less pension for private sector employees and more pension for public sector employees. And that is for the same reason, because not only we increase employment in the public sector and we increase salaries in the public sector, we also increase the benefits in the public sector. Now, what's happening is that international financial institutions are recommending cuts in the public wage bill and in the public sector benefits. So this is also, so this only opportunity, let's call, it's not an opportunity, again, it's not intentional, but this so-called, or that we can call an opportunity, is also to be lost soon if we will keep, or if we will stay in the trend of cutting the public wage bill. Something that is a bit, now, I think that is putting us in a critical situation in the Arab region, is that so many discussions are happening to increase the retirement age. And that is very, very dangerous, I think. And it will affect also women disproportionately.
Could you please wrap up soon? Yeah.
Yeah, all right. So maybe I can speak about increasing the retirement age in the discussion, because this is a discussion point, actually. So maybe later. Let me see. Yeah, I also wanted to speak about voluntary versus non-voluntary pension. In some governments, when we come and we call out their basically approach to pension and to social protection, they tell us that, but we have pension that is voluntary. And one of our colleagues highlighted this. But voluntary, something that a voluntary benefit is not a right. Whereas pension and social protection should be a right. I mean, passports, citizenships, these are a right. Are these voluntary? They're not voluntary. The same, we should think about it the same way when it comes to pension. So when we have pension, it is also voluntary. And also when it is contributory, we are also facing, not subjected to exclusion only, but also self-exclusion. And that is because of the lack of trust in the public systems and the state systems. due to a history of collecting taxes but not giving quality services and quality protection in return. So because they cannot afford contributions, but because also they do not trust that they're gonna get quality pension in return, especially for we have so many instances in the region, like in Lebanon, where we only had an end of service indemnity historically, and still people lost their lifetime savings in the end of service indemnity because of the irresponsible management of people's funds and people's contributions. So this is something also to take into consideration. And women, because they have to pay as a share of their income more on food, on childcare, they tend to self-exclude because they have less to pay on contributions. I think I can stop here. I can maybe later speak about how we are integrating pension in targeted programs and using social registries instead of national civil registries to provide universal pension. This is something that I would want to talk about a bit later, and also to speak a bit more about the survivor benefits that we have instead of having widow pensions and instead of having basically proper pension to women being economic agents, but being also human, irrespective of their economic productivity. Over. Thank you, and sorry for the convolution.
No worries. Thank you so much, Farah. It's really interesting how you linked international financial institution and corruption. That is like a global phenomenon, but like more widespread in the region. Now we've had information from different places, but all of them share common threads, and we would like to think more about solutions rather than the challenges. So Dr. Daniela Jenkins will chair the next session on coming up with solutions, and discussing what a genuinely gender equal pension system could look like, and how we get there. Daniela, I will hand over to you to take us through part 3.
No problem. Thank you so much, Summer. And I do want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions. So if you do have questions, please do put those in the chat so that we can pick up on those. This has been an amazing set of insights for me. To paraphrase a phrase around marriage, all pension systems are gendered, but all pension systems, it appears, are gendered in their own unique ways. And we can see that interaction of the economic status of women, as far as spoken to, and how that interplays, the prioritization of spending, whether that's driven by things like conflict or cuts to public sector, where we might expect to see more women working, for example. We see the role of the informal labor market, both within Colombia and also within South Africa, but also the effects of racialized economic inequalities. And that's something that we see actually in many different countries and different regions that just may be more acute or documented, for example, within South Africa. The role of unemployment, but also this thread that is very clear within South Africa, but actually we see this even within the other case studies as well, this role of household in terms of the distribution of finances as well, so that actually we see that even within households, there can be inequalities that are either driven by those who are in the households or the prioritization of spending within households, very often to women's detriment. So it's within that context that I then start to ask questions about, well, what can we do about gender inequalities? Because in some ways, we see that those inequities that we see that fall upon women in so many different ways around the world, but they still crystallize with the ways in which we design our systems, the ways in which we create our frameworks. I don't know if while I'm speaking or while the speakers are speaking, that if Siobhan could put up slide 5, because in some ways this slide relates to the recommendations, the design recommendations from the OECD. And in some ways, I think the reason why I want to put this up is because I think it really speaks to the paucity of thinking. So these are basically their recommendations for the mechanisms that we can use to equalize pension systems. And I think taking into account what we've heard, it really speaks to the sort of paucity of thinking in terms of how we address these deep-seated inequities. I'm going to put out a couple of questions to the panelists, if that's okay. And firstly, I can either call on individuals or perhaps if you want to jump in, I'd really like to ask the question around demographic shifts. Because globally, we see that there is a tendency towards both longer lives and lower birth rates. Now, we know that there are different distributional aspects around that, but I would perhaps call upon Farah. I know you were talking about, as we sort of closed you off, around sort of structural changes or intentions around that, that perhaps if you could speak to maybe how that element is being incorporated into the design thinking around pension systems and within the MENA region.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So if I understood your question correctly, because I want to make sure I answer it. So you're asking, could you please repeat it actually? I think that would save us
Sure.
time.
So I said, so globally, we see trends towards longer lives, although, as some have said, in poorer health and
Yeah.
lower birth rates. How is that being incorporated within the
Oh,
thinking
yeah.
around designing perhaps a fairer pension system in the MENA region going forward?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have an aging population and we have the youth bulge, and both of these have reduced the amount of contributions into state-led social protection systems in general and into pension systems more particularly. So it's like two extremes. We do have an aging population which reduces contributions, and we do have the youth bulge. And this youth bulge is like coupled or accompanied by unemployment, by more informalization, and we aren't able to keep up. Now, when contributions are reduced, the financial sustainability of these systems is basically challenged. And how are we trying to make this up? And what are the structural, basically, reforms that we're doing to address that? Unfortunately, I am not seeing much. What I am seeing more what I call the legalization of social protection and of pension systems. I'm seeing more laws. I'm seeing ratification of international social security standards. I'm seeing the legislation of a new pension law here and there, but I'm seeing less implementation. So, and in the legislation, we still are not tapping into the financial sustainability, the pension formula, into except for the case of Lebanon, to be honest. In the case of Lebanon, Law 319, which is like the pension law, it's the first of its kind in Lebanon's history. I do really hope that at some point it gets actually implemented. Why? Because it comes accompanied with governance reforms to the National Social Security Fund that will implement this pension scheme if it ever happens. And these governance reforms, first of all, they will benefit other social protection schemes, not only pension. And they entail an independent board and an investment committee that is hired, that will be in charge of how to invest the contributions, because it's a contributory scheme, how to invest the contributions in a diversified portfolio in a way as to protect people's savings. So, but this is also still on paper. So the biggest advancement that has been made is in Lebanon, but it is on paper. I'm not seeing real effort to basically address the how do we call the decline in the level of contributions and the decline in women's subscriptions into pensions. I'm not seeing a real effort, and that's why maybe we get the chance to speak about the international social security standards and the different ILO recommendation 102, Convention 202. I want us to speak about these because I see that even some ministerial declarations that you see the governments, they sign them, but they don't implement them. And what does it mean when we pass a certain law and we do this legalization, lots of legal documents, and we don't implement? What does it mean when we sign or ratify some international security standards and we don't implement? How can we make sure that we have enforcement mechanisms, accountability mechanisms, and follow-up mechanisms? We need to follow up with those governments and ask them, what is it that you did to implement? Now, from a more gender perspective.
So I'm so sorry, Farah. I'm bearing in mind the time, but I do think that those points around follow through are really, really important. I just wanted to make sure that I gave our other contributors the opportunity to be able to input as well. But please do, because I do get the feeling that these conversations will run. I know for one, I'm more than happy. Like, we can sit down, we can talk about this for hours. But one of the things that I noticed that Marta raised was this question of the informal labor force and that sort of impact of many women actually not even falling into that sort of formalized pension system. I just wanted to ask the question very briefly of the role of technology. So is the sort of the rollout of things like platforms, we see things like Uber here within the UK, or we see things like Made.com. Do those sort of platforms help to formalize in some way what has traditionally been an informalized workforce that women might see themselves within, find themselves within? So just posing that question to Marta.
Daniela, thank you. I think unfortunately the answer is no. And also that it depends. It depends on the regulatory framework within the national context and also the specific conditions of the labor market and the regulatory framework of those labor markets. But we know from some of the actually the reports from Human Rights Watch on some of the impacts of the gig economy on social protection, we know that specifically, and I can speak to the case of the United States, there's been a move away from the employer-employee contributions to specifically Social Security, and actually detaching the contractual relationship of the employer and the employee and making the worker an independent contributor without actually providing the employer portion of the contribution. So they're, in a way, informalizing the relationship and also leading to lower contributions to the overall social protection system.
So it's exacerbating the issue, not improving it. Thank you. And so one of the questions that I wanted to ask Elena, Professor Moore, within South Africa, it sounds like a lot of where you find yourselves in terms of pensions arises out of the absence of other social protections within your systems. If you were to make, and I know it's a terrible question, but if you were to make one recommendation to improve that situation, what might you recommend based on your analysis and your purview of the system and the interactions as a whole?
The simple answer there is obviously to create a basic income grant so that able-bodied working age adults are, and there is a temporary version in place at the moment, and we hope that will be maintained and put into place more permanent nature. I think it's a numbers game, really. It's a political will. We're not just dealing with demographics. We're dealing with, austerity. We're dealing with political choices. And I think if I had to respond to your first one, I think at the point of transition to independence, it was an easy win to give generous pensions, not only because the system was in place and all the infrastructure was in place, but there were fewer older people, and who wouldn't give a pension to granny? It's just a political, marvelous, kind of thing to do. However, as you say yourself, Southern Africa has one of the fastest aging populations in the world. So aging and the inevitable cost of aging is beginning to get some attention in ways that it hasn't really needed to in the past. Not only are people obviously living longer, the life expectancy is increasing, but they're living longer in poorer health. And so I think alongside introducing a basic income grant, which I think is obviously very worthy, I think more spending on care provision will help pensions and the gender pension gap, because it'll allow pensioners to spend their pension on items such as food and not on things that are like, incontinence products or things that one would expect to have access to from a more generous healthcare, and these items eat up a pension, and therefore, it leads to have huge levels of poor care provision. I should say, the number of pension beneficiaries has doubled over the last 20 years. So South African state is spending 5 times more today than they were back 20 years ago. But the amount of money has stayed essentially the same when we build into inflation. So the story is quite complex, and we are releasing a new report on this, which will give a much deeper understanding of where pensions sit alongside other forms of relief and support, both social protection, but also care provision. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And please do share that with us. We'd love to amplify that through that work through the Women's Budget Group. So I have a keen eye on time. I'm going to hand back to Summer, if that's all right. I'm not sure if are we able to keep running to open up for questions from the audience.
If the speakers are okay, if we can run for another 10 minutes, that would be great. We have a couple of questions and then we will just wrap up. Is that okay with everyone? Okay, cool. Thank you so much, everyone. We have a couple of questions. We have one in the Q&A box from Tara Van Os, who says, what about promoting an ILO convention on care credits to build up pension rights? Who would like to take this one? Maybe Daniela, you would like to take this one?
I was going to say, my answer to this is very quick. Yes. So one of the fundamentals that drives all of these inequities that we see within different contexts is, in fact, the failure to economically recognize care and the role of care. And so actually some form of structural equalization would go a very long way to ameliorating these issues, even though they manifest in very different ways within different systems. So yeah, that's a quick yes from me.
Thanks, Daniela. We have another question from Silke in the chat. And she says, are there examples anywhere of state-managed defined contribution pension systems that invest in the financial market that actually pay decent benefits? Do they operate with unisex or sex-differentiated actuarial tables? Who would like to take this question? Martha?
I'll take it. It's a little complicated. I'm not fully aware of any that invest in the financial market. A lot of them have different ways of like investing the funds. So not very aware of this. But a lot of the reforms that have happened in the previous years do move towards unisex life tables. So that's been an improvement in terms of like a gender sensitive approach to pensions. Many different systems have moved into unisex life tables.
Thank you so much, Martha. We have also another very interesting question from Paloma, who says, could governments require pension contributions to be made for people doing unpaid domestic labor, similar to former workers? Professor Elena, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I mean, that is the assumption that there is employment. There's many countries across the world where there's very, very high levels of unemployment. And so you're thinking that a care credit will kind of alleviate the imbalance. Sometimes it's not just about gendered imbalances. Sometimes it is, there is no employment or there's very levels of high numbers. So you can't save, you can't contribute over a lifetime in ways. And I think that needs to be thought through a bit more. So for example, one thing would be looking at the national minimum wage. Even if you've been working your whole life with or without care gaps, could you actually, above and beyond what you're going to receive from a state pension, could you actually contribute to a pension? Probably not. And so I think in contexts where there's low levels of national minimum wage, high levels of unemployment, yes, care credits will help, and it'll by all means. But to be honest, most people are engaged in informal, particularly women. If we're thinking about care credits, who it's really going to help. It won't harm, but I don't think the fight is there. That's not where the main problems, at least in Southern Africa, where the main issues rest.
Yeah. Maybe Farah, if you want to add anything to this.
Nothing to add to what has been said. I just want to emphasize something that was mentioned during the discussion today, which is related to gender responsive budgeting. I heard that. And I want to emphasize how important this is. Gender responsive budgeting and gender audits, we need them everywhere, not just when it comes to pension. But when it comes to pension particularly, social spending in many countries of the global south is not enough, okay? But even when it is enough, like for example, Tunisia is one of the countries of the Arab region that has the highest level of social spending as a share of GDP. It doesn't have a pension because it's not what we need, or the criterion shouldn't be increasing the share of public expenditures. It should be how to distribute. It's the distribution. And this is very tricky because not everything is quantifiable, not everything is measurable. So when we are to distribute and to be able to assess and analyze how we can make sure that women benefit from this spending as much as men, or even more when this is needed, when they need to benefit more, this can only be done through gender responsive budgeting and gender auditing, but in an advanced way, not the traditional way. It does need an assessment that goes beyond simple quantification, that goes I mean, it combines or triangulates the quantification and the traditional or conventional methods with very thorough qualitative analysis that captures women realities and women's stories, and especially those that are vulnerable of these women. Maybe there is also, I know I always take longer than I should, but one thing to flag, maybe to open new perspectives for later, social registries and the targeting approach should not be replicated or perpetuated through pension. Unfortunately, this is what we're seeing. We keep calling for the phasing out of poverty-targeted social safety nets, and instead the introduction of universal grants like elderly grants, children grants, disability grants, social insurance. We keep calling for this universal social security scheme as an alternative. Instead, we're seeing the poverty-targeted systems to stay, and we are adding to them old age benefits. But when we count on a social registry instead of a civil registry, we're already starting on an exclusionary basis. And then we're using proxy means testing, and we're using algorithmic targeting methods that have more than 50% exclusion rate on the lowest decile. So those that are excluded are actually the poorest of the poor. So we're not alleviating poverty at all. And this exclusion, like it is on cash transfers of all kinds, like social assistance, it will be on pension if we integrate pension into these, like what has been done in the SAGE program, for example, in Uganda or Kenya. Sorry, I forgot. I'm not in my element today. But yeah, thank you for this.
Thank you so much for this, Professor Moore and Farah. So now, before we close, I would like to invite each of our speakers to share their call to action. One specific thing you would like governments, employers, or civil society to do. Martha, if we can start by you.
My call is to go back to the idea of social insurance and thinking of ways how we socialize risk. We've come through a whole period where risk has been individualized. Pensions have become this do-it-yourself systems where individuals have to account for the responsibility of the contributions, the responsibility of the redistribution within the household, and so many different elements that are beyond the actual responsibility of workers and individuals in society, not just workers also. So I claim for a call back to socializing risk in a way that we actually account for it and understand the determinants of that risk, which are structural, coming from the economy, coming from social relationships, social norms, different institutional factors within the economies that are trying to implement this socialization of risk. And this can only be done through a social insurance scheme that can redistribute between those in higher risk, longer life expectancies, lower lifetime earnings, lower attachment to the labor force because of gig work, because of the impact of structural change in labor markets, without actually saying this risk is gendered, right? Because as we are seeing, this is transforming, the nature of labor markets is transforming, and sometimes being with good intentions, we've designed systems that are very gendered, and the outcomes are not beneficial for women. Examples: the differential retirement age, some of this actuarial determinants through differential lifetime tables. That was kind of like the example that I wanted to bring in. We need to go back to this idea of let's focus on risk, socialize it, and then account for those who are at higher risk of poverty, if you want to call it, in retirement age. Or other risks of outliving their wealth, of having higher impacts on health, all right? And then that will shape itself in terms of covering those who really need it and retire.
Thank you so much, Martha. Daniela, do you want to go next?
Thank you. My call, unsurprisingly, will be a call towards design. And here I sort of evoke the words of the economist Herbert Simon, who talks about design as moving us from where we are to a state of where we ought to be. And I think we fundamentally need to re-examine pensions and the design of pensions, recognizing the inequities. There have really been sort of two key moments in terms of the design of pensions. We see at the beginning of the 20th century through industrialization. This is really where most formalized pension systems emerge from. But we also see within the 1980s this move towards financialization. And again, this is a design choice. Now, we find ourselves globally at the moment in this process of these conflating factors of demographic shifts, economic challenges, but also the challenges arising as a result of climate crisis. And really, I would put a call towards the socialization of pensions in light of those challenges and thinking about design and the design of pensions in those terms.
Thank you, Daniela. Professor Elena Moore, can you go next?
Thank you. So I didn't get the blurb, so I'm now thinking on the spot. But I think my call to action, specifically in attending to racialized and gendered pension gaps, is to not again review pensions and think of pension design in isolation of broader social protection mechanisms that exist in the country or in the region, including, most importantly, care services and access to basic services. It's these coexisting costs that really whittle away any impact that a pension is doing on the ground. And I think without attending to those, in addition to, pensions themselves, and obviously an increase in value and the likes, very little will change. So that's my call to the Southern African regions, is to stop being so pension income centric, and seeing them in isolation for other reform. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting that. Farah, last but not least, very quickly.
I already covered this in my previous intervention. I preempted things. But there was something, and it's what I'm gonna say is not directly in response to this, but it's one of the, speaking call for action, we should be stopping that wave of increasing retirement age. I know that people do have the right to choose whether they want to continue working or not. We should give them this right, in my opinion, but at the same time, even if they choose to do so, the official retirement age at which they are entitled to withdraw or to cash out their pensions should stay the same. So not because we want to realize one of their rights, we take away of them the other right. And this will affect pension policy or pension program design, just like any actuarial study. So this is the only point that I wanted to add. Thank you, Samah.
Thank you so much, Farah. And thank you, everyone, all our incredible speakers, the incredible audience who attended, and those who stayed until the last moment. We will post the recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel tomorrow or in the next days. And if you'd like to follow up on pension policies, reform, please do get in touch, because pension is one of our priorities at the Women's Budget Group, and we would like to hear from you as well. Thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.